Imagine waking up one morning in ancient Rome, walking to the Forum to conduct your daily business, and finding your own name posted on a whiteboard, a public list declaring that anyone who kills you will be rewarded with cash, that your property is forfeit to the state, and that harbouring you is a capital offence. From that moment, you are a hunted animal. Your neighbours, your slaves, even your own family members now have a financial incentive to murder you. This was the Roman proscription, and it happened not once but twice in the span of 40 years. So sit back, grab a cup of tea, and get ready to discover how the Roman state made murder legal by posting public death lists. Learn how Sulla terrorized Rome with the first proscriptions, and how Octavian, Antony, and Lepidus repeated the horror decades later. Understand how friends betrayed friends and slaves, informed on masters for cash rewards, and explore what these episodes of organized state terror reveal about the fragility of law and civilization. The word proscription comes from the Latin proscriptio, meaning to publish or post publicly. In Roman usage, it came to mean something far more sinister, an official list of enemies of the state who were condemned to death without trial. Once your name appeared on a proscription list, you lost all legal protection. Anyone could kill you with impunity. Indeed, the state offered rewards for your death, typically a bounty for bringing your head to the authorities. Your property was immediately confiscated and sold at public auction. Your children and grandchildren were barred from holding public office. You became, in effect, a non-person, an outlaw in the original sense of that word, outside the protection of law. This was not mob violence or revolutionary chaos. This was organized, state-sanctioned murder conducted through legal mechanisms. The lists were posted publicly, the bounties were paid from public funds, and the property auctions were conducted by state officials. The horror of the proscriptions lay precisely in their bureaucratic orderliness, their perversion of legal forms to serve murderous ends. When the state itself becomes the instrument of terror, there is nowhere to hide and no higher authority to appeal to. The first great proscriptions occurred in 82 to 81 BCE under the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. To understand how Rome descended to this point, we need to understand the civil wars that preceded Sulla's dictatorship and the bitter personal and political conflicts that made the proscriptions seem necessary, or at least useful, to those who wielded power. Sulla was a Roman general of extraordinary ability and equally extraordinary ruthlessness. He came from an old but impoverished patrician family, and his early career was marked by ambition, success, and a growing reputation for both military brilliance and personal cruelty. He rose to prominence during the wars against Jugurtha in North Africa and the invasions of Germanic tribes, earning fame and building a loyal army. The conflict that would lead to the proscriptions began with a dispute over military command. In 88 BCE, war broke out with Mithridates, the king of Pontus in Asia Minor, who had massacred tens of thousands of Roman citizens in a single day. Command of the lucrative war against Mithridates was initially given to Sulla, but the tribune Sulpicius Rufus passed legislation transferring the command to Gaius Marius, an older general and Sulla's bitter rival. What Sulla did next was unprecedented in Roman history. Rather than accept the transfer of command, he marched his army on Rome itself. No Roman general had ever turned his legions against the city. Sulla justified his action by claiming that his enemies were subverting the constitution, but the precedent was shattering. The unwritten rule that Roman armies did not fight against Rome was broken, and it would never be fully restored. Sulla captured Rome, drove out Marius and his supporters, and departed for the war against Mithridates. But while he was gone, Marius returned with an army of his own. The aged general, now in his 70s, and reportedly descending into madness, unleashed a bloody purge against Sulla's supporters. Prominent Romans were murdered in the streets, their heads displayed on the rostra, the speaker's platform in the Forum. Marius died shortly after, but his faction remained in control of Rome. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BCE, civil war erupted again. Sulla's forces defeated the Marians in a series of brutal battles, culminating in the Battle of the Colline Gate in November 82 BCE, fought literally at the walls of Rome. The battle was close and bloody, but Sulla prevailed. His enemies were dead, captured or fleeing. Sulla was master of Rome. It was in the immediate aftermath of this victory that Sulla instituted the proscriptions. According to ancient sources, Sulla was addressing the Senate when a senator asked him what he intended to do with his surviving enemies. Sulla reportedly replied that he had not yet decided their fate, but that those he had decided to spare could rest easy. The implication was chilling. Some would not be spared, and no one knew who. Days later, the first list appeared. A whiteboard was posted in the forum bearing the names of 80 Romans, senators, equestrians, and other prominent men who were hereby proscribed. Their lives were forfeit, their property confiscated, and rewards were offered for their deaths. Anyone who killed a proscribed person and brought his head to the authorities would receive a bounty. Sources vary on the exact amount, but it was substantial, perhaps 2 talents of silver. Anyone who harboured a proscribed person was himself subject to death. The first list of 80 was just the beginning. More lists followed day after day. Each morning, Romans would rush to the forum to check whether their names had appeared. The terror of not knowing was as paralysing as the danger itself. Ancient sources report that more than 4,700 names eventually appeared on Sulla's proscription lists, though the exact number is impossible to verify. What is certain is that the killings numbered in the thousands. The proscriptions unleashed a nightmare. Romans hunted Romans through the streets of the city. Men were killed in their homes, in the baths, in temples where they had sought sanctuary. Bodies littered the streets. The Tiber ran red with blood. Heads were brought to the forum and displayed on the rostra, the very platform where the great orators of Rome had delivered their speeches. The sight of severed heads rotting in the public square became grimly familiar. The system rewarded betrayal at every level. Slaves who informed on their masters received not only the bounty, but their freedom. Sons who betrayed fathers, brothers who turned in brothers, were enriched by the confiscated estates. The social bonds that held Roman society together, the relationships of patron and client, master and slave, parent and child, were weaponized for murder. Trust evaporated. Every friend was a potential informer, every servant a possible assassin. The economic dimensions of the proscriptions were inseparable from the political ones. Sulla needed money to reward his soldiers, and the confiscated estates of the proscribed provided it. Land, houses, slaves, art, furniture, everything owned by the condemned was seized and sold at auction. The auctions were often rigged, with Sulla's favourites purchasing valuable estates at a fraction of their worth. New fortunes were built on the bones of old families. This is where we see the corruption at the heart of the system. While the proscriptions were nominally directed against political enemies, they quickly became a mechanism for robbery. Men were added to the lists not because they had opposed Sulla, but because they had valuable property that someone coveted. A wealthy man with a desirable estate might find himself proscribed at the request of a neighbour or business rival who wanted his land. The lists became a tool for settling private scores under the cover of political necessity. The arbitrary nature of the proscriptions was their most terrifying feature. Names were added retroactively. Men who had already been killed were added to the lists to legitimize their murders after the fact. Others were proscribed for trivial connections to Sulla's enemies, or for no discernible reason at all. One man was reportedly proscribed because he owned a beautiful house that caught the eye of one of Sulla's supporters. The message was clear. No one was safe. Wealth, connection, and past loyalty offered no protection if someone with power wanted what you had. Escape was possible, but difficult. Italy's borders were watched, and harbouring the proscribed was itself a capital crime. Some fled successfully, making their way to Africa, Spain, or the East, where they waited in exile for Sulla's power to end. Others hid in Rome itself, protected by loyal friends or servants who risked their own lives to conceal them. The sources preserve touching stories of faithful slaves who hid their masters in attics or cellars, disguising them, bringing them food, and finally helping them escape the city. But for every story of rescue, there were many more of betrayal. The lure of the bounty was too strong for many to resist. Family members turned on each other. The slave who had been trusted for years might calculate that freedom and a cash reward outweighed the bonds of loyalty. The neighbour who smiled at you in the morning might denounce you to the authorities by afternoon. In this atmosphere of universal suspicion, paranoia was not irrational, it was survival. Sulla eventually retired from his dictatorship in 79 BCE, an extraordinary and unprecedented decision. He died the following year, his body cremated in a funeral of spectacular pomp. But the damage he had done to Roman political culture was irreparable. He had demonstrated that the machinery of the state could be used to murder political opponents on a massive scale, that confiscated property could fund political power, and that terror could be systematized and bureaucratized. These lessons would not be forgotten. 40 years later, Rome descended into proscription again. The assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE set off another round of civil wars. Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, fled to the eastern provinces. Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony, his heir Octavian, and the general Marcus Aemilius Lepidus initially maneuvered against each other, but eventually recognized that they faced a common enemy. In November 43 BCE, they met on an island in a river near Bologna to form an alliance. This alliance, known as the Second Triumvirate, was formalized by law, giving the three men dictatorial powers for 5 years. But to fund their armies and eliminate potential enemies, they agreed on a new round of proscriptions, and this time they traded names. Each triumvir contributed the names of his own relatives and allies to satisfy the vendettas of the others. The coldness of these negotiations, bargaining over who would live and who would die, reveals the cynical calculus of power stripped of all pretense. The triumviral proscriptions of 43 BCE were even more extensive than Sulla's had been. 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians were reportedly proscribed, though again, the exact numbers are uncertain. The scale of the killing was enormous, the terror more systematic. Soldiers fanned out across Italy hunting the condemned. The rewards were the same as under Sulla. Bounties for heads, confiscated property sold at auction, freedom for slaves who informed. The most famous victim of the triumviral proscriptions was Marcus Tullius Cicero, the greatest orator of his age and perhaps of any age. Cicero had denounced Mark Antony in a series of speeches called the Philippics, comparing him to the tyrant Philip of Macedon and calling for his destruction. Antony never forgave him. When the proscription lists were drawn up, Octavian initially tried to protect Cicero. The orator had supported the young heir against Antony. But in the end, Octavian sacrificed Cicero to seal the alliance. Cicero's name was traded for the life of one of Antony's relatives. Cicero learned of his proscription and attempted to flee. He was carried in a litter toward the coast, hoping to escape by sea, but his party moved slowly, and Antony's soldiers caught up with him near his villa at Formiae. According to the most famous account, Cicero ordered his slaves to set down the litter and faced his killers calmly. "There is nothing proper about what you are doing, soldier," he reportedly said, "but do try to kill me properly." He stretched out his neck from the litter, and a centurion named Herennius beheaded him. But death was not the end of the indignity. Antony had ordered that Cicero's hands be cut off as well as his head, the hands that had written the Philippics. Head and hands were brought to Rome and displayed on the rostra, the platform where Cicero had delivered so many of his greatest speeches. Antony's wife, Fulvia, according to some sources, took the head in her hands, opened the mouth, and drove her hairpin through the tongue that had spoken against her husband. It was a gesture of savage triumph and personal vengeance. Cicero's death symbolized the end of an era. He had spent his life defending the Roman Republic, the system of senatorial governance and traditional liberty that he believed made Rome great. His death at the hands of the triumvirs and the public desecration of his remains announced that the Republic was truly dead. The men who now ruled Rome had no use for eloquence or tradition. They ruled by the sword. The proscriptions produced countless stories of betrayal and survival, tragedy and heroism. Some Romans were turned in by their closest relatives. A son might betray his father for the bounty, or a brother inform on a brother. The sources preserve the names of some of these betrayers with evident disgust, holding them up as examples of human degradation. But they also preserve stories of extraordinary loyalty. slaves who protected their masters at the cost of their own lives, wives who hid their husbands and helped them escape, friends who risked everything to save those they loved. One story concerns a man who hid in a well while his wife pretended to soldiers that he had fled. Another describes a slave who dressed in his master's clothes and was killed in his place, buying time for the real target to escape. A third tells of a wife who concealed her husband in a clothes chest, then bribed the soldiers who came to search her house. These stories cannot all be verified, but their presence in the historical record testifies to a desire to remember that human decency persisted even in the darkest times. The economic impact of the proscriptions reshaped Roman society. Vast estates changed hands, sometimes multiple times. Fortunes that had taken generations to build were seized overnight and sold to the highest bidder, or to the most politically connected. The wealth of the Roman aristocracy was redistributed, often to men of lower status, who had the cash to buy confiscated property. New families rose to prominence. Old families were extinguished or impoverished. This redistribution served the immediate needs of the triumvirs, paying their armies. Civil wars are expensive, and soldiers expect to be rewarded. The confiscated estates provided the cash and land that kept the legions loyal. But the long-term consequences were profound. The legitimacy of property ownership was undermined when everyone knew that titles could be traced back to confiscation and murder. The social hierarchy was scrambled when traditional aristocrats lost everything and newcomers bought their way to the top. How many died in the proscriptions? The ancient sources give numbers that cannot be verified. Appian reports 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians proscribed under the triumvirs, plus unknown numbers of ordinary citizens killed in the chaos. Estimates for Sulla's proscriptions range from 1,500 to nearly 10,000, depending on how the counting is done. What is certain is that both episodes killed thousands of Romans, including many of the leading figures of their age, and terrorized many more who survived but lived in fear. The proscriptions violated every traditional Roman value. Fides, the sacred obligation of good faith and trustworthiness, was shattered when men could not rely on their closest relationships. Pietas, the duty owed to family, gods, and country, was mocked when sons betrayed fathers and Rome turned on its own citizens. Clementia, mercy, was explicitly rejected in favor of calculated slaughter. The Romans had always prided themselves on these virtues, seeing them as the foundations of their civilization. The proscriptions demonstrated how quickly those foundations could collapse. The psychological toll on survivors is difficult to measure, but must have been enormous. Those who lived through the proscriptions had witnessed their world turn inside out. They had seen neighbors kill neighbors, friends betray friends, the state itself become an instrument of murder. They had learned that law was no protection, that wealth was a liability, that the most dangerous thing you could have was something someone else wanted. How do you rebuild trust after that? How do you believe in institutions that have been so thoroughly corrupted? The long-term political consequences were equally profound. The proscription set a precedent that political opponents could be killed by the state without trial. They showed that armies could be funded by confiscating the property of the condemned. They demonstrated that terror worked, that systematically murdering your enemies was an effective way to consolidate power. These lessons shaped Roman politics for the next century and contributed to the transition from republic to empire. Augustus, who had been Octavian during the triumviral proscriptions, later cultivated an image of clemency and reconciliation. He claimed to have preserved lives, to have forgiven enemies, to have restored the republic. This was largely propaganda. Augustus established an autocracy that ended the republic forever, but it reflected an awareness that the proscriptions had been a moral catastrophe that needed to be forgotten or reframed. Even those who benefited from the terror understood that it could not be openly celebrated. The Roman proscriptions find echoes throughout history whenever states turn against their own citizens. The terror of the French Revolution, with its lists of enemies and its systematic executions, followed a similar logic. The purges of Stalin's Soviet Union, with their show trials and mass killings, were proscriptions on an industrial scale. The Cultural Revolution in China turned neighbour against neighbour in ways that Romans would have recognised. The pattern repeats: official lists, legal pretexts for murder, rewards for informers, confiscation of property, the breakdown of trust. The technology changes, the human dynamics remain. What do the proscriptions reveal about human nature and society? Several things stand out. First, they show how quickly civilized societies can descend into organized murder. Rome, in the 80s and 40s BCE, was not a primitive or lawless place. It was one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history, with elaborate legal systems, literary culture, architectural achievements, and philosophical traditions. Yet within weeks or months, this civilization produced lists of citizens to be killed for bounty. The veneer of civilization proved thin, the restraints of law and custom easily discarded when power and survival were at stake. Second, they show the danger of legalizing violence. The genius, if that word can be used, of the proscriptions was that they worked through legal mechanisms. They were not riots or coups, but official acts of state, conducted through proper procedures by legitimate authorities. This made resistance difficult. How do you oppose murder when murder has been made legal? The proscriptions remind us that law itself can become an instrument of injustice, and that legal form provides no guarantee of moral content. Third, they show how economic incentives can override moral constraints. The bounties, the property confiscations, the auction sales, all created powerful inducements to participate in the terror. People who might never have killed for ideology killed readily for money. The proscriptions were, in part, a massive transfer of wealth from the condemned to those who condemned them. Understanding this economic dimension is essential to understanding how the system functioned and why so many participated. Fourth, they show both the worst and the best of human nature. The betrayals were real and numerous, but so were the acts of courage and loyalty. For every slave who informed on his master, there was another who risked everything to save him. For every son who betrayed his father, there was a wife who hid her husband at the risk of her own life. The proscriptions tested human character at its extremes, and some passed the test while others failed. Finally, they remind us that political violence has consequences that extend far beyond the immediate victims. The thousands who died were only the beginning. The survivors were traumatized, the social fabric was torn, trust was destroyed, institutions were corrupted, the precedents set by violence shaped future violence. The Roman Republic never recovered from the wounds inflicted by the proscriptions. It staggered on for another generation before collapsing into autocracy. Violence of this magnitude leaves scars that last for generations. The whiteboards in the Forum, the names written in ink that became death warrants, the bounties paid for severed heads. These images from Roman history carry a weight that transcends their ancient context. They speak to something permanent in human experience, the capacity for organized cruelty that lurks beneath the surface of every civilization, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The Roman proscriptions occurred 2,000 years ago, but they still have something to teach us. They teach us that legal systems can be corrupted, that civilized societies can commit atrocities, that economic incentives can override moral restraints, and that political violence, once unleashed, is very difficult to contain. They also teach us that even in the worst of times, some people find the courage to protect others, to hide the hunted, to resist the terror however they can. Both lessons are worth remembering. The lists are gone now, rotted away 2 millennia ago. The Forum where they were posted is a ruin. The Romans who fled, fought, betrayed, and died are dust. But the story remains, preserved in histories and biographies, a warning from the ancient world about what happens when the state becomes an instrument of murder and the law becomes a license to kill.